welcome everybody. I'm really, really, really excited to be doing this. It's not a webinar, it's just a video, really, a bit of a Q&A about menopause for World Menopause Day. And what better person to have on than Helen Tomlinson, who is the UK Menopause Champion. So basically, when there was the select committee which looked into menopause and how the position of women could be much better, particularly in the workplace but elsewhere as well, one of the main things was to appoint a menopause champion to look at industry, to look at different sectors, and to work out where the gaps are and where things are needed more kind of emphasis. And that's what Helen's been doing, and been doing a fantastic job, I'm sure. So Helen, fantastic. I'm so pleased that you have agreed to do this. The format.
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. So the format's pretty simple, but we'll probably depart from it like we always do. I've got some questions for you, and I think you've got some questions for me. But I thought, before we start, it might just be interesting just for you to tell us where things are up to, really, because we've had I think since we've last spoke, I can't remember when we last spoke, but there's been a change of government. So it'd be interesting just to hear where things are up to from your perspective, really.
Absolutely. So I was appointed in the Menopause Employment Champion role in addition to my day job. So my day job is Head of Talent and Inclusion at the Adecco Group. So we're a global recruitment business. And I was appointed into this role after we launched our menopause policy in 2021. I was lobbying government to make change, lobbying for them to make having a menopause policy a legal requirement. And at the same time, the Women and Equality Select Committee created a report that had 8 recommendations in it. One of those recommendations was to have a menopause employment champion. So everything kind of came together in the January of 2023, and I was appointed into the role and asked to create a strategy around retaining talent in the workplace across 5 sectors that government chose, where attraction was challenging, retention was challenging, and there was a lot of vacancies in those sectors. And they were manufacturing, healthcare, care, retail, hospitality, and manufacturing.
That's a lot of sectors, Helen. I think,
yeah, absolutely. A professional and technical. And then the education sector came to me, aviation and oil and gas, and said, we're really struggling to retain talent. Can you help us as well? So I created a strategy. I called it No Time to Step Back. And the reason that I called it No Time to Step Back was because I absolutely believe that life transition, which happens to 51% of the population, is no time to step back from your role, your career. We have to remain economically active much longer than we ever used to, and women need to stay in the workplace and be supported to thrive and reach their full potential. So I launched that on World Menopause Day in 2023. And then on International Women's Day 2024, I launched my report called Shattering the Silence, which was an update on what we'd achieved over that period of time. And then we went into pre-election period because a general election was called. So that meant all activity had to stop. And I just heard last week that the new government not necessarily don't want to carry on with the role, but they don't want to carry on with it in the way that it is now and the strategy. So I'm out of contract almost with government now, and I have a call with them today to see so they can tell me just what they're going to do moving forward. So bittersweet moment, really. I feel like we've achieved a lot, but it's not gonna. I've created that No Time to Step Back group out of the back of that, so a group of passionate employees who want to see change, and there's no way I'm going to stop working with them and driving change forward.
Great. And forgive me for this, Helen, because we've done quite a few things in the past, so you might be a bit bored now of hearing me explain how I got into menopause.
No, absolutely. Tell me about it.
But I think it's useful because the first question that I want to lead on to really is it's a simple one. Is kind of what's really changed since you started getting involved. But before doing that, I might preface kind of my background to it, which is somebody who 7 or 8 years ago was sat in front of a client that came in to see me for legal advice about menopause discrimination, and I think I've always been pretty candid in saying back then I just thought menopause was something to do with hot flushes and something that I vaguely remember my mum having some difficulties with, and it was pretty much the extent of my knowledge.
Yeah.
And then that led me down this kind of path really of trying to understand as much as I could, and how you would bring a menopause case. And then that led to me speaking in various places. BBC Woman's Hour was probably my favourite place to be speaking, and ultimately at the select committee where I was talking about some of the things that I'd seen as a practitioner, and exactly what you were saying, very much a kind of movement of talent out of the workplace, mostly because of just a complete and utter fundamental lack of awareness in society about menopause. I was faced with situations where judges didn't really know a great deal. I was faced with cases that I was bringing in the past where we were always being put to strict proof on the disability points. So clients of mine were having to give lots of detailed medical evidence. So I found that I'm in a different environment now. I found that, other lawyers will know about menopause, the judges know more about menopause. We're now very clear on how it has to be described, mostly as a discrimination claim, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more. So I've seen loads of positive changes, but it'd be interesting from your perspective, just in simple terms, what's different now? How is it different now?
The first thing I would say is that I just used to talk, even when I first started having these conversations, we just use the word menopause. And actually, when you put menopause into a search, it comes up as the average age of being 51. And as soon as we started, so you only really got an audience of around that age, because naturally you think, it doesn't affect me, I'm only 44 or whatever. And as soon as we started to talk about perimenopause and give it the correct terminology, so menopause is literally the day when you haven't had a period for 12 months. So you only know that in retrospect. So perimenopause is the between 7 and 10 years before that one day when all those hormonal changes are happening and cause the symptoms. So if you look at the average age of perimenopause, it's 41. So you're already opening up the conversation just by using the right terminology to a much broader group of people, and actually the group of people that really need it. But also considering, so that's the first thing I would say, broadening out the terminology. And then we started to look at that and think, but you're still only getting people who are of that demographic. Whereas if you consider the people who have a forced menopause through hysterectomy, have a hysterectomy at any age, early onset menopause, and even there's another term which I can't remember off the top of my head, which is really, really young men. You can technically go into menopause anytime after puberty. So, and 1 in 100 go into menopause under the age of 40. And then there's the really early menopause. But what that allowed us to do is opening up that conversation and that terminology allowed us to engage every demographic in the workforce, so every generation, because we started to talk about hormonal health, we started to talk about periods. So that naturally, if you are a person who has periods, you will be having them from the day you start in your career right through things like potentially endometriosis, fibroids, polycystic ovaries, PMS, PMDD, into fertility or lack of fertility and the challenges around that, motherhood, post-motherhood, coming back into the workplace, and then going into perimenopause, menopause, post-menopause. So we were supporting women right through the workplace. So now I very rarely go out and talk about menopause. I talk about women's health in the workplace. And I think that's broadened out the conversation so much more and normalised some of those topics that, you know, were taboo up until very, very recently, and using the right terminology. Don't talk about sanitary products, don't talk about product placement, talk about what it is. It's a
Mm,
menstrual cycle, or it's a period.
mm,
And I think that's helped to break down the taboos as well. And the other thing is, when you look at those average ages of 51 and 41, that's based on a particular demographic. So making sure that you have everybody involved in the conversation, because everybody's experience is entirely different. So talking about the experience of related to race, ethnicity, culture, disability, socioeconomic demographic, bringing all those voices around the table. There's still a lot of work to do in that regard. Some of it's cultural, some of it's just simply that it tends to be a certain demographic that wants, you know, really drive it forward for
mhm.
many reasons. But having that diversity of thinking and conversation around the table, that's what I've seen starting to happen as well. So it's still new news to a lot of organizations, but what we're taking to those organizations, certainly from my perspective, is a much broader conversation, not
Mhm.
just going in and talking about menopause and everybody else in the organization being entirely excluded because they're only 25 or whatever,
Yeah,
and
that's
assuming it's
really,
nothing to
really
do with
interesting,
them.
because I think, I could definitely share that view that when you look at this as a subject, what you're actually looking at is a much wider thing,
Mm,
isn't it?
mm,
And um, I think sometimes that's probably overlooked. And the big question very often is about, the biological processes that women go through
mm,
and how they affect them in the workplace, and
mm.
and how organizations can ensure that they're not kind of disadvantaged as a result of that. Not always an easy thing to do, but it's part of that kind of
Yeah,
circle, isn't it?
absolutely.
As I've told you
It's a
many times
business.
before, I've got three daughters
You have?
at home who will be going
Mm-hmm.
into the workplace, and it
Yeah.
genuinely, it really disturbs me, the thought that they could potentially be disadvantaged in
Mm,
some way, simply because of the
mm,
sex that they were
yeah.
born with. And I think, it's a lot different than it was, but it's still something. I mean, I often think that maybe I'm more motivated about that because I've got
Yeah,
daughters,
of
but I'd like to think
course.
it's not just exclusively because of that.
Absolutely.
Helen,
It
I want to
scares
ask you
me
a
that
question.
the Go on.
Sorry,
I
no,
was going to say something then. I'm going to
you
tell you
tell
something
me
then.
something first.
Okay. It worries me that the gender pay, well, it horrifies me. The gender pay gap will take another 45 years to close.
Hmm.
And that isn't, so that probably won't even be in my lifetime. So that, first of all, is shocking to think that, you know, we've still got so much work to do. But also, it won't be probably solved in my daughter's career. My daughter's
Mm-hmm.
25, so probably she might just have finished work by the time the gender pay gap is resolved. But that's not about parity of pay, that's about parity of opportunity. So ensuring that women have the same opportunity as their male counterparts in the organisation. So that for me is a really important statistic that PwC published earlier this year, and women's health in the workplace is absolutely aligned to that, because unless we support women through those life stages that can disadvantage them, we are never going to solve that. So I think that's really fundamental. And one of the key aspects of that is when I did my No Time to Step Back event last Monday. So the first one back in February was all about menopause. So that's all we talked about, different aspects of menopause. This one, we actually talked about menstrual health because it allowed us to open up the topic. And we had a gentleman talking about PMDD and how absolutely underfunded that is, but debilitating it is as well. So bringing those different topics into the conversation is helping people in the workplace. And one of my final thoughts on that point before we move on is one of my greatest hopes is that, and I saw it on the train the other morning, that we get to a stage where you don't feel, and it doesn't apply to me anymore, but I sat opposite a girl who went into her handbag, put a tampon down the sleeve of her jumper to walk to the bathroom on the train. And there is still so much shame and stigma attached to something that is 100% natural and happens to 51% of the population. And I long for the time when we don't have to stick a tampon down our jumper sleeve.
Yeah. But things change though, don't they? Because and we do have to be positive about these things. And I'm getting on a bit now. You'll tell by my hair color. And when I started doing employment law many years ago, mental health wasn't really a thing, to be honest with you.
Absolutely.
It
World
was
Mental Health Day today.
exactly
Hmm?
very topical as usual. And that's completely changed. So I think what initially happened was people thought, oh, it's just another thing we're going to have to deal with. And then there was a real kind of shift towards businesses actually thinking, well, actually, if people have better well-being, they're happier at work, and their mind is clearer and they're more focused. Guess what? It's better for the business, and that was a real change. And you see that, that change in other areas as well. And and it's worthwhile being positive about these things, isn't it? That
Oh,
change does happen.
completely.
It's not always immediate, and very
Completely.
often sometimes it
Takes
shouldn't be
time.
immediate. Actually, yeah,
Yeah. But it takes people standing up and talking about, when I talk to clients about strategy, it's, lived experience is such a key part of an
yeah,
organization's cultural change that, to allow people the opportunity and to encourage them to share their lived experience for the benefit of other people is so important.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that the positive steps in that
Hmm?
way, isn't there? That I think we're
Yeah,
all seeing. I'm
yeah.
desperate to ask you a question that I always get
Go on.
asked. So,
Go on.
a lot of I say a lot of it was quite a big part of the select committee and various kind of articles that have been published on this talk about the way that menopause is described as a protected characteristic. So a
Mhm.
lot of the types of things I deal with very often is to do with discrimination. And there isn't a kind of automatic label for, there's no such thing really as menopause discrimination, because discrimination has got to attach to a protected
Mhm.
characteristic. And it was the kind of dilemma I had when I had the first client is, sounds like sex discrimination, it's potentially age discrimination,
Mhm.
but the answer to that is that it's basically disability discrimination. And the reason for that is it's only through disability discrimination that you can talk about failure to make reasonable
Yeah.
adjustments. And that's very often how discrimination manifests itself when we talk about
Mm.
menopause. So you use the terminology of disability in relation to menopause. So I often get asked about that and how I feel about that, and I'd be really interested to see what you think about that,
Mhm.
and the fact that, try not to give you my opinion, but menopause is a natural process, isn't it?
Absolutely.
In the
Mhm.
same way that age is a natural process, it's
Yeah.
something that happens to you, but we don't talk about age in the sense of being a disability. It
No,
sometimes definitely feels
absolutely not.
like it,
Yeah.
but what do you think about that? Because it's important.
It's very important, and it is a tricky one because I was so I believe for some people, so tell me just remind me, because
Mm.
you're a lawyer and I've got a performing arts degree. So you remind me
Same thing, very
what is
similar,
classed
similar
as a
disciplines.
disability? Has it got to be something that impacts only for 6 months or 12 months?
Well, so when it comes down, so the Equality Act, Section
Mm.
6 of the Equality Act is what we're dealing with. So it's a disability. You're disabled if you have a mental or physical impairment,
Hmm.
which has a substantial effect upon your ability to do day-to-day activities. So
Okay.
that's what
Mhm.
it is. So generally speaking, that is going to be something that is not
Is it time bound over a period
situational.
of time?
Usually you're looking at 12 months,
Okay.
but it's not always definitive, that,
Yeah.
because for
Okay.
certain types of disabilities, like cancer, you might just have that straight away. You've not had it for that
Yeah.
period of time, but
Hmm.
it still means that you're disabled. So
Yes. Yeah.
you know
Okay.
it so that's what you're looking at. So what you were describing menopause as, what the law describes menopause as, is a mental or physical impairment. The reason why it could be quite difficult for somebody that's in a situation where they feel that they've been discriminated against is that they have to establish that. So you could have somebody, an employer, that says, well, yes, we recognize that you've got menopause, we're not disputing that, but we don't agree that it has a substantial effect upon your ability to do day-to-day activities, so we're going to put
But
you to the test.
doesn't only the person going through it have the ability to define whether it's impairing their day-to-day activities. So
No.
let me give you a live
Yeah.
example. So my experience was, and I've been very open about this before to encourage other people to be open. So my lived experience was that I had extremely heavy and erratic periods for, I think, probably about 2 years in total, maybe 2.5 years. And that meant that, so my job at the time as a sales director, I was going out, meeting clients, giving presentations, traveling on the train, lots of different things like that. I couldn't really do any of that. So I just worked from home for that period of time, long before COVID. This is in 2013 to 2015. And I did a lot of my work online, etc. Did presentations online. So I would not have classed myself as having a disability. However, if I'd worked in a manufacturing plant, or if I'd been a teacher, which I trained to be, but fell into recruitment, as many people do, I couldn't have done my job. I physically couldn't have stood up in front of a classroom. So that would have impaired me from doing my job. So I'm a little bit conflicted because I don't want it to be described as a disability. In the majority of cases, it is not a disability. But there are symptoms of it that can be debilitating and technically not allow you to do your job. So from a protection perspective, because if I had been a teacher, I would have had to have been off sick for a very long period of time until I persuaded the gynecologist to let me have a hysterectomy, because they were really, really reluctant to let me do that for some reason. So I guess there are cases where it absolutely prevents you from doing your job, and there has got to be protection for those people, because if they're forced to do the job when they can't, their only alternative really is to leave that job, which is the last thing that we want. But I don't want it to be, for all the right reasons, don't want it to be described as a disability.
It just seems like it's not the right label, but it's the only one that's there. And I know that there was discussion about whether to introduce a new protected characteristic of menopause, which is a really kind of interesting point, really. And I have to say, when I was at the select committee, I kind of felt quite motivated to go for that, because it seemed it seemed like the right thing. But actually, if you think about it, it's pretty difficult. The parallel that was drawn was to talk about the fact that you have pregnancy and maternity as a protected characteristic, but the difficulty is, I think that's slightly different, isn't it?
Period of time,
exactly,
isn't it?
Exactly. And so the problem is, I think if you did a similar thing with menopause, it'd be very difficult, because at what point do you say that you have that protected characteristic? And of course, my kind of understanding of this as a subject is that not all women have a terrible time with the menopause, do they?
Exactly.
So it's not an automatic thing that they might have symptoms which substantially affect the day-to-day activities.
Where does it end? Because if on a technicality, if you are going through menopause, which is 51% of the population will, 25% will have no symptoms, 50% will have some symptoms. How do you define whether, it's subjective, isn't it? What a symptom that one person could tolerate might be something that another person couldn't, or depending on location, where they work, etc. Lots of different things to consider. But then
what
where
happens
does that
in
leave?
practice? Well, I'll tell you what happens in practice. So you work somewhere and you say that you've been discriminated against through menopause because somebody said something to you, or somebody's refused you something that would help you, whatever that might be. So you say, I've been discriminated against. Now, the employer, so the respondent in the tribunals, might say, we don't accept that you have a disability, except you've got menopause, we don't accept that's a disability. What actually happens in practice is that the claimant, the employee, is then put to proof about that
Mm.
disability, which means that they have to provide
Oh.
medical evidence. But
Mm.
not only that, usually what happens is there's a preliminary hearing, which can last anything, it can be a full day's hearing in which the claimant is cross-examined on their medical evidence and what they
How
say about how
utterly
it affects
horrific.
them. Yeah, it can be really horrific, and they have to prepare something
And
called a
that's
disability
why women
impact
don't do
statement.
it.
Yeah,
That's why
but
they
there is
don't take it.
well, there is a positive side to this that I've seen just on the kind of ground dealing with this, is that years ago, the cases that I did, pretty much every single one ended up like that. And it was kind of
Mm.
taken as read that that was the approach and you had to prove it and you had to get medical evidence, all the rest of it. I have seen a bit of a shift there where it's, employers aren't quite as quick to
Mm.
um, to put a claimant through that process. And actually, I had a couple of cases where I managed to get costs against the employer for doing that very thing, because I said it was a
Mm.
complete
That's horrific.
a waste of time. So that, I think that really is horrific, and that's the thing that I've seen that's very difficult, because particularly with menopause, if you're providing medical evidence about that, it's very, very personal stuff, and to
Oh
be
yeah, can you imagine
providing
if I
that in
had
a
to provide mine? I mean, I'm a very confident person and would happy to talk about it, but I totally appreciate that not everybody. And actually, right then, when I was in the thick of it, I wouldn't have been comfortable talking about it. It's only in hindsight, and
Mhm.
as the conversations evolved, that I feel, confident doing that. But I mean, that would have just been absolutely awful. I've got a question though. So
Mm.
if it was made a protected characteristic, which I don't know whether it will be or won't be, and I'm not able to comment on that. But if it was, would it still not ultimately be sex, age, or disability related? So if if I took somebody to a tribunal under the protected characteristic of menopause, but they'd said something to me that they wouldn't have said to a male counterpart about my menopausal symptoms or
Mhm.
whatever, stop complaining about your hot flushes or whatever.
Mhm.
Would that not be on sex discrimination still?
Well, you can choose which way you go
All right,
down, and, and
okay.
some of that will depend upon the circumstances. And as we're speaking now, you can bring a claim of
Mm,
discrimination related to the menopause under sex
mhm.
discrimination, potentially under age as well, and that has actually been done. But you don't do that because of that very reason, that actually what you're mostly arguing about is an employer that hasn't adjusted things in the
Yes,
right
yeah,
way to take account of the fact that somebody
yeah.
is disadvantaged by the fact that they've got those
Mhm.
symptoms of the
Interesting.
menopause. So you get to the same place through
Mm,
disability. You get to kind of where you need to be in
yeah.
terms of being able to raise these issues
Mm.
and potentially have a finding of discrimination. But it's that kind of societal thing of the way that it's labelled that I think
Yeah,
is just inherently problematic. But like
yeah.
lots of things in life, sometimes you just have to, that's just the way it is. But I do
Mhm.
wonder, and I genuinely don't know the answer to it. I don't think there is an
And
immediate
I
answer
don't, but
to
I
it.
think
Yeah.
it's a really interesting because from a now I wouldn't want it to be classed as a disability, but
Mm,
actually at that point in time, for me, if I'd worked for a different employer and they'd said, well, you've got to come into work every day, you've got to
mm,
drive 40 miles commute and you've got to go out on client presentations. And I mean, that just, it would have been impossible
yeah.
physically
Yeah.
and mentally, to be fair.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm always conscious, and probably the same thing as well. I always have this thing where we have these conversations, we end up talking about tribunals and things, and the
Mm,
law and discrimination, all the rest of it. That we don't. It's important to know all of those things because you kind of need to know the bookends of it, don't you? You need to know where
Yeah,
things can
absolutely.
end up. But a lot of what we actually talk about is not that kind of stuff. It's the kind of day-to-day
Mm,
interactions. It's the fact that there's an awareness, the fact that years ago, 5 6 years ago, if you'd reported to your line manager that you were having difficulties with the menopause, you would have just been met with a kind of
yeah.
blank face, and that's so unbelievably common. And I think some of that comes again from society. So my mum went through the menopause, and I had a vague kind of memory of it not being a good thing. But my dad would
Mm,
never. I don't. He wasn't like we explored. It was all just women's troubles. It was a very kind of like secretive world,
Yeah,
really.
absolutely.
And I think that I think that's how it was. And so some of that is, some of that lack of understanding, being generous to people, probably comes off the back of that. But something I've conscious of is that this is a private thing, isn't it? It's to do with, private medical, issues,
Absolutely, yeah.
reproductive stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
I always think
Mm-hmm.
that all of this has got to be tempered with that some people may want to talk about it, other people may not. I mean, the protections have
Yeah.
always got to be there, but I always think that is something that needs to be recognized as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
definitely. And, in some cultures, they absolutely don't talk about
Hmm.
it at all. And generationally, it hasn't been talked about. But I think it's also important that you educate, particularly in business, that whilst we are empowering women to talk about it and we're educating managers and leaders to take receipt of the conversation, it may be that some people just simply do not want to discuss it, which is completely fine. But there still has to be an understanding that whether they want to talk about it or not, they may be experiencing it. So,
Yeah,
how
absolutely.
providing that education is probably doubly important if somebody's not going to talk to you about what they're experiencing. So, but just having that knowledge and understanding, so important. I did a series of workshops on Tuesday at a manufacturing company, and it was the second time I've been in, and they'd mandated it for all their line managers. It was very predominantly male environment manufacturing, and there was some of the line managers, and I was thinking, I'm sure you came to it last time, and I was slightly worried because it was exactly the same thing that I did last time with a few, obviously I'd go off piece a little bit. But they'd asked if they could come back because they there was so much to absorb, they couldn't absorb it all. And you think about the forgetting curve, you forget 70% of what you learn 24 hours later. But they wanted to just make sure that they'd really understood it, not just for the workplace, but for their home life as well. So, I think that there is more awareness, and almost you don't want to be. I had people come in and bringing their teams with them as well, which was really impactful because they were showing their colleagues that they understood what they were experiencing.
So this might be a little contentious, so get ready for this. It's not very contentious. I think we
Wow.
just talked about it before, but I think from the outside looking in at this, it's quite easy to form a view that you've got women who know about menopause because they're women, and men don't know because they're
Mm.
men, and that actually looking at how discrimination, things like that might happen, that the dynamic of that is more likely to be men discriminating against women. So I've handled lots of employment tribunal cases and grievances and all kinds of things relating to menopause, but on both sides, acting for employers as well as employees as well. And that actually that's not the picture I've seen. I think, if I'm honest, I think the more common aspect actually is sometimes, I'm being very cautious here, but it's sometimes women actually
No,
who
I don't disagree.
may have not. I get this
Yeah.
thing that I hear a lot of, I didn't have a bad time of it, or I think no, I say what it is. I sailed through the menopause. So
Mm.
I want to explore with you that dynamic because it's something that
Mm.
I've seen, but it's not something I often feel I've got to be a touch brave to kind of raise that
No,
in
I
these
don't. I don't think you
scenarios.
have to be brave at all. I
Yeah.
think men, given the right education and the right space to ask the questions. So I do a lot of men only sessions because they like to have a safe space where they can ask questions, not feel embarrassed, not embarrass somebody else, learn. And I think that's brilliant that they want to do that. So I do a lot of men only sessions. And when you've done that, they can be some of the best allies,
Hmm.
best upstanders. But you're absolutely right. If it's not their lived experience, as in, women who have sailed through it, and 25% do, so it's
Hmm.
not, uncommon, but they can. If that's not their lived experience, it's hard for them to understand how somebody else is having a different experience.
Hmm.
So actually, yeah, that lack of allyship can be prevalent.
But it's still the same point about awareness, isn't it? Because I think,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
it
You only
always
know
comes
what you
down to
know.
that. Yeah, and
Mm.
I think some of it's misperceptions. It's probably and again, I think that probably you would see less and less of that. But it's just relevant to me because I'm a man, and there's not a huge amount of men that talk about this issue. And I sometimes feel that I kind of ended up talking about this issue through just kind of fortune, really, just having a client that was
It is.
really nice. That
Yeah, absolutely. Mm.
and I was able to kind of kind of get interested in it really. But again, it shouldn't be to the exclusion of talking about other types of issues as well, should it? And I think as a
No.
broader point, I think the more that men feel comfortable talking about things, the more useful men
Mm.
are. So as a side issue, it's completely different from menopause, but it's something I'm
Yeah.
quite interested in, is the way that men are treated through the maternity
Mm-hmm.
process. And
Yeah.
and very often you talk to a lot of men about what it was like having meetings with midwives, what it was like going through that whole process. They'll very often say the same thing, which is what I experienced, was that you are very much a side.
Mm.
You're kind of like the joke
The
character
bit
in
part.
the whole.
Yeah,
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 you really
absolutely.
are the
Yeah.
bit part. And
Yeah.
for some reason, it makes you inclined, certainly from my perspective. I'm not, I do, I think other people have experienced it. It kind of makes you act up in that role where you tell silly jokes and you just
Yeah.
feel completely
Yeah.
excluded from it. And
Characterize it, caricaturing, isn't it?
yeah, and I think that's
Are you
that's
playing to
that's
the
to the
character?
detriment of us all,
Mm.
really. I think because actually, men need to be part of that, and they need to feel that they are, because they are part of it. They
Mm.
really are part of that and can be very useful in all of that, but not when they're kind of pushed out of that little process. And that that's a kind of generalized thing as well, just about how we
Yeah.
how we operate together and how we kind of get the best results from things, really. So I do think it's a kind of team effort, really. But I've found that when I've done talks about it, I found that it's harder to get men in the room. I think when they're
Mm.
there, they're really receptive to it. But I
And I
think it can be.
wonder, see, I've not really. I've only crossed one organisation who said, "Oh, we don't want to do a men only event because we want to be inclusive." And I said, "I completely agree, but you're only going to get inclusivity if you get education and they feel comfortable." So for me, doing those sessions where you can ask anything, and I always start them by saying, "You're never going to see me again. You can literally ask me anything. There is nothing." And I talk about, I naturally open it up with some of
Mhm.
the lesser known, because I often ask, what are the five symptoms, or the top five symptoms, or that about menopause, and then I'll go through the whole 40 plus. And the ones that always come up are, hot flushes, night sweats, um, lack of sex drive, irritability, and I can't think of another one off the top of my head, but there's always, a core group. So I open up the conversation then about heavy periods, dry vagina, and I use the words intentionally, because so that they know that I don't feel uncomfortable talking
Mm.
about any aspect of it. And it always starts off about the workplace, but then we're all almost end up educating about from a home perspective as well. And once you get one person opening up, I think that's really impactful. So,
Mm.
and then other people tend to open up. So they've, I've always found, and I wonder if it's because it's a man talking about it with men, or you kind of think that was easier, but then you think, well, you only know it from your perspective,
Mm.
whereas
Mm.
I've got the lived experience that I can share.
You're just better at talking as well, I think, Helen. That's why people. It's probably just that. It's
It'd
the
be
main
quite
thing.
interesting to do them together, though, to see what sort of response.
Yeah, definitely,
I think
definitely.
that'd be quite good.
With men, I think you're right. I think it's like there's got to be the first person on the dance floor, really, hasn't there? And then
Oh,
and then
and
and
that
then
is
every
absolutely it. And it is a
usually me.
brave
Yeah,
person, the first person on the dance floor, because it's a responsibility to then open it up for everybody else.
yeah, definitely, definitely. And
Mm.
and again, that's it's a very very positive thing.
But I
We've
agree,
we've we've not
men
done
are the
any of our
best
questions.
allies.
We've
No,
not
I
done
haven't
any.
even
We've
looked
not a
at mine.
single one, which I
I've
knew I
saved
knew,
them
I
to
knew that we
my
wouldn't.
iPad.
Um, but I wonder if you've got any questions for me, because I've been kind of doing all the
Oh, I
questions.
have.
Oh yeah, that sounds
Um,
bad. Yeah, they're just.
and we've actually covered some of them
Mm.
already. So what's the biggest change that you've seen? I mean, I know that tribunals have increased 44% year on year. That is obviously a risk to businesses. It's a difficult situation for the people who are going. Nobody takes an employer to a tribunal lightly, I wouldn't say. So what have you seen in terms of the biggest shift in that conversation about, either whether it's the confidence of the person bringing it or that type of thing? What have you seen as the biggest shift?
Well, so the interesting thing is that the law's not changed, actually. I think people have got a bit of a misperception that there's been some kind of change in the law. There hasn't actually. I mean, there's been guidance which has been brought out, which has been useful. Took a while to come out, but it's there, and it talks about what reasonable adjustments may look like, but it's not law, it's guidance. So the law has remained as it always has. Actually, there's been no shift. There hasn't been a new protected characteristic that's been introduced. So we are as we were. But what's changed is, well, look, I'll give you a very clear example. So the first case I dealt with, it was, a social worker. She initially was diagnosed as it being a mental health issue because she was struggling with memory, she was struggling with sleep, she was struggling with concentration. So that's how it was described originally, was mental health, depression, anxiety, stress. But then she saw a more enlightened doctor who was able to say, no, it's hormonal, it's to do with it's menopause, and it was very clear that it was. And she spoke to her line manager about it, who didn't know what menopause was. Well, I said didn't know what menopause was. Hot flushes, and that's the end of it. She then went to go for an appointment with me, and I didn't know either. But I learned, in fairness. We then went in front of a judge who didn't really know about it as well. So that's changed, and we had to also as well. We had to provide detailed medical evidence and disability impact statements and all that unpleasantness. So why are we different now? Well, you probably got a doctor who's more likely to say that it's menopause rather than it's just mental health straight away. You've probably got a line manager in a business that now has some understanding of menopause. You've got judges that know about it. You've got solicitors now who won't have to go on Mumsnet whilst they're in a meeting with a client and work out what type of discrimination it is. That's not like that. Judges as well. So that's a massive, huge shift. And I'm not to say that situation finished, we're all sorted now, don't worry about it. But that is progress, and it's good to see progress that hasn't come.
And I think we need to just take a moment, because when was that case that you mentioned then about the social worker?
2017, something like that. Yeah.
So that's only 7 years ago. And you think about how many generations have not even uttered the word up to press, really, the leap, that seismic shift there between what you've just described and that enlightenment today. And I absolutely agree that if we were that evolved, we wouldn't have people going to a tribunal in the first place, and I accept that, but that shift there is incredible.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the point about the statistics in terms of how things are described in the tribunal, which is more what it is actually. What you're actually getting, and it's difficult to reveal it in the statistics, is it's not necessarily like you're getting more cases, it's just that they're labeled differently. What were mostly probably disability discrimination cases based upon mental health or other issues are probably now more based upon menopause because of that awareness piece as well. But again, even tribunal statistics, they're not always, sometimes the reason why there's a case in the tribunal is because the HR process just wasn't done properly. It's not necessarily that this. I mean, I act for organisations, so I'm not just somebody that's there acting for employees and fighting it. In fact, probably more so for organisations. You never ever really find an organisation that discriminates on purpose. I'm going to discriminate against menopausal women. That's a good thing to do. We hate them. We're going to be nasty to them. The same with anything, any race, what gender, whatever. That's never really the case. It's by mistake. It's very much by mistake. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we have processes in place so mistakes aren't made. And very often the mistakes that are made with discrimination is we apply the same policy to everyone because that seems fair. But the effect of doing that is one group of people actually end up worse off. So
Yeah.
and you get those problems when you
Mm.
have organisations who go, oh, I've got a policy, so we're all right on that. We're done. The policy is in a drawer
Yeah.
or on a phone, so we're okay. We're protected, but not actually thinking about what do you do in
Mm.
practice? How do you have a conversation with somebody?
Yeah.
How often do you keep in touch with them and see how things are going? Smaller, quick interactions with staff are much better than having a big one where you've got loads of stuff to go through. So it's part of a wider piece, really. But
Yeah.
I can genuinely feel positive about this because there has been a shift. What you still get are organisations which pay lip service to it and hide behind policies. And rather than actually getting into the nitty gritty of where something has gone wrong, they just say we've got a policy about it, and just everybody
Yeah.
kind of freezes. Most employment situations that I deal with, I'd say almost all of them never needed to be in an employment tribunal. If a slightly
Mm.
different
Yeah.
conversation had
Yeah.
happened at a particular point in time, it wouldn't be there. And that's what people need to focus on.
It's interesting you say that about the quick interactions rather the regular interactions rather than saving things up, because
Mm,
that again is a generational thing, isn't it? When we look across the generations in the workforce, the norm to me is having, really sort of defined generationally, is having the defined, you have an annual appraisal or an appraisal twice a year, and you have a review at the end of every month and things like that. But when we look at how our Gen Z colleagues want to work and want to be treated, it is those quick interactions and
mm.
regular catch-ups. And actually, as we move forward, that could really change the landscape, and also being able to, bring your whole self to work, that feeling of belonging and being able to be open in the workplace. Those two things together may reduce the number of, tribunals and things like that.
It will. I mean, it just
Mm.
genuinely will, and I think, the more, yeah, I mean, the shift I think I've seen is that people used to kind of perform a role
Yeah.
at work. It
Yeah.
was almost going
Yeah.
onto the stage, you'll know about
Yeah.
that, where it's like, I am a solicitor, so I'm going in and
Mhm.
I shall be like a solicitor and I shall speak like
Until
a
I leave.
solicitor
Yeah.
until I leave, and then I'll do whatever. But no, that's definitely depleted.
Absolutely not.
And
No.
commercially as well, people prefer somebody that just talks to them normally as well.
Oh,
So
completely. Yeah.
menopause is part of something bigger, isn't it? You can't.
Mm.
I've heard a lovely saying which I keep using: is you can't take the egg out of the omelette. Well, it's like that with menopause
Yeah.
and all of these other issues. It's all part of the same kind of thing, really.
Completely. Completely.
Well, this has been great, Helen. I think as I predicted, we've not kept any of the agenda. We've not kept any
No.
of our questions, but I
I
kind of
think
thought
that's when
that
we're
would
at our
happen.
best.
Absolutely. So honestly, thanks so much for
Oh,
doing this.
absolute
We
pleasure.
really appreciate it, and really appreciate everything that you've done and everything that you continue to do as well. Everybody always speaks so highly about you, and so yeah, it's good to be able to speak to you
Thank
about this.
you. Yeah, good to catch up.
Great. All right.
Take care.
See you
Thank
soon.
you. See you
Bye.
soon.